We're still in Ecclesiastes. We've got a few more weeks to go. I was going to try to do chapter 8 and the first 10 verses of 9 today, but I timed myself and decided that chapter 9 was not going to get in, so we'll do chapter 8 today and tackle chapter 9 next week. Chapter 9 starts a whole new subject anyway, and it's a subject that many of us don't like to talk about, but it's talking about death. So we'll save that for next week, but that isn't the whole of the entire subject, so you don't have to stay away because of that. Today, Solomon is going to talk about government. It's always a great subject. And the title is government good or evil? Well, it depends. Now, just as a little bit of review, in chapters 1 through 7, if you remember, Solomon was experimenting with a lot of things. He experimented with science, wisdom, pleasure, materialism, fatalism, egotism, religion, wealth, and morality. And he was seeking different ways to be happy here on this earth, under the sun, and he found none of these things brought happiness. His conclusion was, outside of God, all was vanity, emptiness, and travail of soul. But he revealed the secret to happiness at the end of chapter 2, and we've gone over this before, but it's kind of the theme that we have taken throughout this entire study. In verses 24 through 26, he says, "Nothing is better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God." Now, as I told you before, many atheists and agnostic people, they take this as meaning just enjoy this life, live it up. You don't have to leave God out. But that's not the message that Solomon teaches, as we're going to see here. He says, "Nothing is better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I?" He was the richest man in the world. "For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight." Now we're going to see that. We have seen it several times. We're going to see it again today because he repeats that 8 times in this book. So that's really the subject of this book, not all the doom and gloom that we see that many have looked at in this book. He actually reveals the secret that it is a gift of God. In fact, he says that joy is the gift that God gives, not happiness. You know, happiness just depends on happenings. If happenings are good, we're happy. If happenings are bad, we're not happy. It's kind of an up and down thing. But joy is a fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And you know, it's a good thing to look at those 9 things and take an inventory of yourself. I usually find I'm lacking in a couple of them, particularly patience. I was not built for patience, and every once in a while I will lose my patience. So when I take inventory, there's 1 or 2 of them that I have to work on. But joy is one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit that he gives when we are saved. When we become a child of God, we become a person that can have joy in our life no matter what the circumstances. Amen. Which is what his message is over and over again in this book. Now, happiness again depends on events, and joy is something you can always take with you and always have with you. And by the way, this is the way you can should be able to distinguish a Christian from a non-Christian. You can't always, but it should be. And that is, you can look into their face and see if they have joy and see if they have love. Now, that's why we shouldn't walk around with long faces. We have a reason to be joyful. Even if something just happened to make you unhappy for the circumstances, Remember, other people are looking at us, and we should present the fact that we have joy in our hearts and we have the Spirit of God in our hearts, so therefore we have a reason to be joyful. From here to the end of the book, there is no more experimenting. It's more like Proverbs, I would say, but there's these little pithy statements that are almost in riddles, so you have to kind of riddle out what he's saying. But this is wisdom that is coming from the wisest man who ever lived. And the opening verse in chapter 8 asks a great question. So let's jump in and look at that. Chapter 8, verse 1. He says, "Who is like a wise man? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed." A man's wisdom makes his face shine. I'm going to mention two examples in the Bible where someone's face was shining. You can probably think of them both. One of them is in Acts chapter 6 when Stephen was being stoned, and just before he died, he looked up into heaven and saw the face of Jesus standing by the Father, and he said to receive his Spirit, just like Jesus did when he was on the cross, and his face shone. And everybody looked at him like, what's this all about? And who's he talking to? He was talking to God. The other example was Moses, if you remember, in Exodus. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai after spending 40 days on Mount Sinai getting the law, his face shone. And after several days, he no longer wanted to show his face, so he put on a veil. Why did he put on the veil? He didn't want the people to see that the light that was coming from his face was fading away. People look at that the opposite way, that he was putting on a veil for a different reason, but that's really why he was putting it on. Those two things, two examples in the Bible, when you're at the face of God, when you're in the presence of God, you actually glow. And that's something to remember as well. Now he moves to the subject of government, which is not one of our favorite subjects, but which both Paul and Peter address in Romans chapter 13 and also in 1 Peter 2. Chapter 8, verses 2 through 5, he says, "I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he who does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful. And a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment." Now, we don't have a king in this country. Some countries do, but we have an executive branch, and we have a president who heads up that executive branch. And so therefore, he's telling us, as he's telling everyone who reads this, that we should obey the king. Now, if you are a naturalized citizen, you took an oath when you became a citizen. Who here took an oath when they became a citizen in this country? I bet we have another one here. Soon. Oh, okay, soon. Great. But you took an oath when you became a citizen. Now, some people don't realize that every time you say the Pledge of Allegiance, you're taking an oath. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the nation which it stands under God. You're taking an oath not only for your nation, but to God. You're taking that oath. So therefore, you should realize you're taking an oath not only to the country, but to God. Now, we know that we've had some instances of people not wanting to stand when Our national anthem is played, and I hope that's playing itself out, but it's still
Amen.
happening to a certain amount of extent.
Amen.
And I think it's just awful because we're making a pledge to God. And you take someone who's making $25 million a year or something like that, and they're crying because they can't get another job. And all of these other people are supporting them by their actions. I just think it is awful, and I think that hopefully it's going to play out soon. And I hope the owners get together and decide this is not a good thing because they work for somebody. They took a pledge also to them, and they've let them get away with it to this point, but I hope it's soon. Now, obeying the government is not always convenient. For instance, jury duty and paying taxes. That's another thing. Who likes to pay taxes? And they keep saying my taxes are going to come down, but all the calculations I make, they're going to go up. I think tax reform is a good thing, and I'm all for it because I think it should simplify the system quite a bit, and it's so complicated now, it's ridiculous. But if you live in California or New York or New Jersey, your taxes might go up instead of down. Oh, although they're still working on that, so I shouldn't say that. Maybe there won't be something that we will have. Now, Romans 13 says, government is ordained by God. The cruelest to the best are all ordained by God. And by the way, in this country, we elected those guys. Somehow, they got in office because of us, so who are you going to blame? You're going to blame the guy down the street or somebody else who voted for the wrong person, but it's ordained by God. And you're not going to always like who's in charge. I remember when, I'm not going to get into politics here, but I'm going to mention a couple things. When Obama got elected, one of the guys, one of our large clients, the president of the company, said to me about 3 years after he was elected, I voted for a guy who I now hate. And I go, why? He said, I didn't know he was going to move the country so much. And now we see people that Trump is in office as divided families. They're families that are split right down the middle because they don't like what he's doing going the other direction. But the fact is, the Bible tells us there's two things that we need to do for our leaders. You know what they are. Number one, obey. Number one is pray. Pray and obey for him. If you don't like Trump, pray for him. If you don't like Obama or didn't like him, pray for him. In fact, one of my very good friends who runs a private equity company is a staunch Republican, and he's Obama's best friend.
He's a what?
He's Obama's best friend, still today. He lives in Washington, D.C. as a private equity company, and I asked him, I said, John, that's his name, why is it that you're so close? He said, well, our kids grew up together in the same school. We became friends, and I realized he's a good family man. Now, he may have all these other things I disagree with, but he's a good family man. So I don't have any issue with the guy. I just don't like his politics. So we need to pray, we need to obey.
Amen.
Now in verses 3 and 4, the second reason we are to obey is because the state has power to compel us to do so. Now I was coming down Crown Valley Parkway about a week ago, and if you know the area, and you probably do since South Shores Church is there, the speed limit is like 50 miles an hour. Then you start downhill coming down toward the church, and your car tends to pick up speed unless you're on the brakes, and there's a policeman that parks there. I think it's National Park, right on the corner,
in National Park.
with his ray gun, and so he got me doing 63 miles an hour. So he pulls me over, and I start spouting off something, and Tony grabs my arm. She says, let me do this. 5 minutes later, he talked this person that she talked about and gave me a ticket. So I was going to say the wrong thing, I'm sure, but I should have had a ticket. they can compel you to obey the law either through fines or through force. They can put you in jail. So that's the other reason that we need to obey the law. Because the state has the right to compel us by fine or force. Now, Will Rogers said, we ought to be grateful we don't get as much government as we've paid for.
That's a good one.
Now, we don't even pay for all the government. They print money to run a lot of part of the government, and I don't like that either, but it's a good saying. Verse 6, because for every matter there is a time and judgment. Though the misery of man increases greatly, for he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? You know, if you've never been to court, I can tell you there are anxious moments in court. Now, especially when a jury is involved, because juries go more with their emotions, I have found. Now, I can tell you that when you're in business and you're successful, you're going to get sued. It's just, my lawyer told me that right up front, so we've been sued many times. Of course, I thought it was unjustly every time, but that was me. But twice we were sued by an employee that was a shareholder that left the company, and we paid him exactly by the formula. Then we sold the company later, a year later, for a lot more money, and they wanted that deal, not the deal they got. So both of our lawyers in both of these judgments said this is a slam dunk, they don't have a case, no problem. But they asked for a jury trial, and one of them brought his two little daughters in and his wife in and sat right up front, and they're all crying, you know, while this is going on. And we lost. And I had to pay the money. That was ridiculous because they had something in writing before them, but the jurors, they go, well, these poor family, look, this big business guy has messed them up. The other one, thank God we won, and it was a jury trial as well, but you never know what's going to happen when you go to court. So there is anxious moments, even though the attorney says everything is going to be okay. You're going to need to look out. Verse 7 again says, for he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? Remember O.J. Simpson? I mean, what a ridiculous thing. Everybody knew he was guilty. In fact, he was proven guilty in a civic case later on, but it only involved money. But he got off for murder. 2 people. You never know when you have a jury, or you have very clever lawyers, I can say that. Solomon says life and events are not a sure thing. It's full of surprises. In verse 8, is that where I am? I think so. No one has power over the spirit to retain the spirit, and no one has power in the days of death. There is no release from that war. There is no release from that war, and wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. Now, Solomon faces a sticky point here. He says you may lose your life obeying the government if you're in the service. You ever know someone that was in the service, maybe they got a medal or 2, and they got a medal because they're the only one that survived. Everybody else was killed. And maybe they saved some people somewhere along the way. And usually they'll say something, I don't know why I survived. Everybody else was killed. But only God knows that. We don't know when that happens. Death is in God's hands. But somebody who said, all my buddies got killed and I was saved and I'll never know why. The second point it makes here is no one is discharged in time of war. There's no way out in time of war. If you're drafted to go, if you're able-bodied to go, you go. You know, there's been only one soldier that has been executed since the Civil War for desertion. Anybody know his name? Should be a famous person, only one. By the way, in the Civil War, there were many. His name was Eddie Slavic, and he just couldn't stand the thought of killing someone. So he laid down his gun, and he deserted. Now, when he came to trial, everyone wanted to see this young man get off, because he was a nice young man, and they thought he really had a good reason for desertion, because he didn't want to kill someone. But they couldn't let him off, because if they'd have let him off, how many more desertions would they have had? So he had to die. Verse 9. All this I have seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There is a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. What is he saying? He recognizes there is evil in government. Anyone doubt that? Evil is universal, whether it's a democracy, whether it's monarchy, or whether it's communism. It's universal. But government itself is not evil. It's the people running the government who are evil. And we know that. This past year has been more corruption exposed in government than any time I can ever remember. When you hire a special counsel attorney to investigate someone, what do they find out? They find out stuff on everybody, because everybody else comes into the picture. And I've said to myself, if they had a special attorney trail me from the time I started a business up until the time till now, they would find something wrong. I guarantee you they would find, maybe a lot of things they would find wrong. And now they're investigating this person and then this person, and they find this person over here is guilty. And what you come up with, and you don't like to think that, is there's a lot of people that are corrupt in government. Verse 10. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness. In other words, they went to church every Sunday. And they were forgotten in the city were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity. In other words, he had been to a funeral of a prominent government leader, a man everybody knew was evil. But at the funeral, he was praised, exalted, and glorified. Some preacher, some mortuary chaplain or whatever just talked about all the great things this person had done. Anybody ever go to a funeral where they got up and talked about all the evil somebody had done in their life? No matter how bad they were. They pray them right out of Hades into heaven and preach them right out of Hades into heaven right there. And I can tell you, if Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, died tomorrow, he would be praised in his country for all he had done for that country, and he's killed millions of people, or starved millions of people. Yet he would be praised. That's just the way our society is. By the way, I tried to figure out what is the religion in North Korea. Does anybody know?
Communism.
It's atheism.
Oh, yeah.
They don't have a religion. There are a very few Christians and a very few Buddhists. Very few. But their religion is atheism or they're agnostic, one or the other. Verse 11, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Boy, what a good one is that. That is one of the most honest and accurate observations on human life I've ever heard. Delays in justice often increase crime and encourage criminals. You know what the average time on death row was in 1984? 6 years. You know what it is today? 15 and a half years. The average time on death row. By the way, that's only in 32 states because the others don't even have the death penalty. It's amazing. That's why I say, and I've said, and I will continue to say, that fair and honest judgments are one of the most important parts of government, because it's the last court of appeal, is go to the Supreme Court or go to the federal judges. And if they are corrupt, or if they don't make speedy decisions, it just increases crime. Verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. That's our key verse today that's in your notes. Verse 13, but it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said that also is vanity. We've all seen this many times. The righteous prosper, or the righteous get taken advantage of, and the wicked prosper. We see it in all of our lives. First, the searcher admits there is evil in this, but God will preserve his own, despite what happens to their bodies. Jesus said to his disciples, so fear not those who can harm the body. He said, fear God who can destroy both the body and the soul in hell. That's who we should fear. So the body is not the most important thing. Now, there were a lot of people that thought Jesus, when he was crucified and dead for about 3 days, before God raised him up, but would soon not only be dead, but be forgotten. They thought they had finally done their work. It was over and done. They could go on about their business. Until after 3 days, and he was raised from the dead, and they started hearing these rumbles that he may be alive. And they panicked, because many of them were the ones that put him to death. But Jesus, the second part where he says that God will judge the wrong in his own time. By the way, the reputation of Jesus goes on forever and ever. The good reputation of him, he's the most famous person who ever lived, period. Whether you like him or not, whether you love him or not. Second, he says here, God will judge the wrong in his own time. Though the sinner seems to be getting away with murder and does the same thing 100 times over, God is watching, and he or she will give account. One of the things we need to keep in mind, because our perspective is that a person's life, whether saved or not, is this life. Every person who is ever born, every person, will live eternally somewhere. And if you look at that perspective, this life that they have here, whether it's 10 years or 100 years, is just a tiny speck of how they will spend eternity. And those that spend eternity in heaven will be glorified and magnified and living a happy life for eternity, and those who are in hell will suffer for eternity. So we say that this isn't fair when we see someone who is prospering here and someone who else deserves to prosper here and it's not. Well, God is fair. And they will face judgment, and they will spend eternity suffering or being rewarded for what happens. In verse 13, he says, the wicked will not prolong his days like a shadow. That's an interesting statement. What does that mean? The meaning of that is life prolonged like a shadow is not real life. Not at all. It is the influence of a man after his death. When we were in Jerusalem, Israel, a few years ago, we went to Herod's tomb. Now, Herod was called Herod the Great in his time, and many people thought he was a great man, even though he was very wicked. And of course, he had lots of money, so he built quite a tomb. And we walked up this dirt road, up this mountain, on up to the top, and we saw what I thought was Herod's tomb. And I thought, well, is this really his tomb? It was a giant monument we were looking at. And there was a shadow coming over because the sun was setting behind there. And at the bottom of the shadow, someone said, no, this is not his, it's way down there. Probably halfway up the mountain. So you looked, you couldn't even get down there. You just looked down and you saw his tomb way down there. But he wanted that, he built this tomb, by the way, before he passed away. He knew exactly what he wanted. And as the sun come by and that shadow was going down over his tomb, I thought, the shadow of an evil, evil man was there. That's what it means by that. It was revealed at his death. By the way, Adolf Hitler was revealed at his death for what he was, and that was he was a wicked man. He is despised and abhorred around the world, even in the people in Germany. Look how long they have had to live down this man. They're shameful even today when you go to Germany to talk about it, because they recognize the cruelness of this man and what he did to the world. So the shadow is the influence of a person after they die. And the searcher comes to the same conclusion he has come to before in verse 15. So I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. I want to say this is not justification for living it up now and leaving God out. For enjoyment, and he says this over and over again, does not come from living it up here and now, but it is a gift of God which can come even in difficult circumstances. The joy of the Lord can be in our hearts no matter what. This is what Paul meant, I think, when he said, I have learned the secret both to be abased and to abound. Have you learned that secret? I haven't yet. What secret is he talking about? Well, he tells us in the next verse. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What a powerful statement that is. I always think of the opposite when I quote that verse or think about that verse, because Jesus said to his disciples the night before he died, without me you can do nothing. So you go from nothing without Jesus to I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Beginning with verse 16 here, and to the end of the book, the author does not introduce anything new. He simply enlarges and repeats the claims that he has made throughout this entire book. And that is this, that the significance of life is found only in daily contact with a living and true God. Now, it's taken me a long time in order to realize how important that statement is. But I can tell you, having lived life on the edge and having lived it everything in between, that living your life in contact by prayer, by reading the Bible, by meditation, is the only way to live. Because everything else is up and down. And you're on a merry-go-round, going around and around. And when you're living your life in contact with a living and true God, you can have joy in any circumstances you're in. I know, I've been both places, I've been there and I've been there, and it works. Now he gives 4 good reasons for not trying to solve all the problems and answers all the questions that life throws at us. 4 reasons. Verses 16 and 17. He says, When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep, day or night. Then I saw the works of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. Life is too complicated, too vast, too filled with conflicting elements. For anyone to figure out all the elements is impossible. Did you see the movie Bruce Almighty? If you didn't see it, it's a fun movie to watch because this guy, Jim Carrey, who's the character, he got passed over for a job that he thought he should have as an anchorman, and he thought his career would kind of go sideways. And he says, God has not been just with me. Life is not fair. So what happens? Well, God, in the form of a man, Morgan Freeman, I think it was, comes along and says, okay, why don't I just let you play God for a while? He turns it all over to him. And he thought, great, I'll show him how it's done. In come the prayers and the phone calls and the messages, and he's going like crazy trying to answer them like this, and finally he just threw his hands up. I don't want this job. How would you like to have God's job? I mean, it's just impossible even to think about. How many of you have solved a problem with a sleepless night?
With what?
A sleepless night. You roll over in bed and you're thinking about this problem I got. How many of you actually solved a problem before you woke up? I haven't. Now Tony says to me, now what you need is a pen and a paper on the side of your bed.
Oh, yeah.
So you can write it down. I say, I don't want to write it down. I want to forget it. I want to wake up tomorrow and it's over.
Yeah.
Not often do you solve a problem in the middle of the night, just worrying and meditating and whatever. We should reason and think about what God is doing and what life gives us. We should do that. We should read, we should pray, we should meditate and think, but realize that mysteries will still remain. Until Christ returns, we will be left scratching our heads, sometimes crying, asking the eternal questions, and what are those? Why? How? When?
Where?
Where? Are all of those things. We'll be asking them. You know, many today think our problems will be solved by artificial intelligence, augmented reality, or robots. In fact, we have these things called, hey Google, I set with them, you know, an Echo, which we talk to, play my favorite music, and what about this thing? And it'll do searches and answer us back, and you know, we have all this stuff. So it's going to solve all our problems. I received a video this past week from our daughter in Boise, and it was a robot that had been created that was very human-like. I mean, very, very human-like. It's almost scary. Her name is Sophia, if you want to download it on YouTube. And Sophia kind of wakes up, and she's been created, and she looks at this guy and says, who are you? He says, I'm your creator. I'm your maker. So guess what she does? She starts asking him a ton of questions. I thought robots had the answers. And all she was doing is asking questions. And well, they got to learn before they can teach you. So they're asking questions. And I thought, what good is this? Asking more questions than I could even have answered. You know, just what we need is more data and more robots and more artificial intelligence to make life more complicated. Think about your own life. How many things happen to you were determined by events that were completely out of your control. You had no plan on them. They just happened. We were sitting in Starbucks Friday morning. We go to Starbucks on Friday morning, and there's a guy that lives next to us, and he has a friend that's usually there, and we talk to them quite often. He's an interesting man. And before his friend showed up Friday morning, I said to him, George, you have an interesting life. What do you do? Or what have you done? He said, well, I worked 25 years for the FBI in Washington, D.C. He said, I made a visit to Southern California. I went back, turned in my gun, my badge, said, I'm quitting. I hated Washington, D.C. So I came to California, and I went to work for J.C. Penney's because my father was the president of J.C. Penney's. This is 25 years ago when they were very, very successful. And he says, when he retired, I became the president of J.C. Penney's. I'd worked my way up. And then I did that for a while, and I started to thinking that there is no recycled cotton. You know, clothes are made out of pure cotton. There's no recycled. So I went to China, told us where he went there, and he asked them about recycling. He said, we don't do any of that. He said, why don't we build a factory to do recycled cotton? So he built the first factory in the world to do recycled cotton. And he told us how this all worked. And now he's a multi-millionaire, and he's, in fact, I think he's got the Super Bowl contract to make all those.
Wow.
He's famous. He's a multi-millionaire. And I sat by this guy for a year and never asked him, who are you or what do you do? I couldn't even make this up when he went on talking about his life and why he travels all over the world all the time. And I said, well, when are you going to retire? He said, retire? I'm only 67. He said, I got a long ways to go yet. What an interesting man. We must learn to live with mystery and leave the unsolvable to God. I'm going to close with a couple of my favorite verses out of Isaiah. In Isaiah 55:8, God said, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither are my ways your ways. We can never anticipate God's sovereign plans. Most of you used to try. We only know what he told us in his book. He's got a lot of plans that he hasn't told us about, or at least he hasn't elaborated on. He only told us what he wanted us to know. And then he goes on to say, for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. And then I will close with another one of my favorite verses in Isaiah 26:3. And this is probably one of your favorites. It says, he will keep you in perfect peace.
Whose mind is stayed on you.
Finish it up. Whose mind is stayed on thee, because I trust in thee. God bless you all. Hopefully we'll see you next Sunday.
Amen.